Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the CUNY Graduate Center. Thank you all for being here this evening. I'm Danielle Zak, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Human Rights at the City College of New York. As a longtime fellow and affiliated scholar of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies, I'm absolutely delighted to be here this evening to warmly welcome you to this evening's book talk, a joint endeavor with the Primo Levi Center. As an academic space that draws together scholars and practitioners from around the world to grapple with pressing global challenges, especially in the areas of conflict, human rights, mass atrocity crimes, and humanitarianism, the Institute is so delighted to have here with us tonight Professor Davide Rodogno, who will present his recent book, Night on Earth, A History of International Humanitarianism in the Near East, a very rich historical analysis of international humanitarian programs in Central and Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Near East from 1918 to 1930. Professor Rodogno is Professor of International History and Politics and head of the Interdisciplinary Master's Program at the Graduate Institute for International Development at the Geneva Graduate Institute. He specializes in researching on international organizations and associations, philanthropic foundations, and transnational networks and movements since the 19th century. His research includes the history of human rights of minorities, of crimes against humanity, and international law, the concept and practice of international development and programs, state building, and international administration since the League of Nations. Professor Rodogno will be joined in conversation with two additional prestigious panelists, Joshua Craze and Rajan Menon. Joshua Craze writes on art, war, and literature. His works have appeared in many different magazines and newspapers, including Foreign Policy and The Guardian. His Grammar of Redaction, which examined the strange linguistic categories of the redacted documents of the War on Terror, was exhibited at the New Museum in New York, and he has written catalog essays for Jem Holzer's redaction paintings. Dr. Craze has had residencies in Marrakesh, where he was a UNESCO Artist Laureate in creative writing, art, only New York, and most recently at the Embassy of Foreign Affairs in Geneva, where he began research for a new project in the archives of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. He's going to be joined also on our panel by Rajan Menon, who is Director of Grand Strategy Program at Defense Priorities, and the Anne and Bernard Spitzer Chair Emeritus in International Relations at the Colin Powell School of International Studies at the City College of New York. He is also a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute for War and Peace Studies at Columbia University, and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Menon is the author of numerous academic publications and news articles, his most recent book being Conflict in Ukraine, The Unwinding of the Post-Cold War Order, authored with Eugene Romer and published by MIT Press. So I'm going to turn the floor over to our guest speaker. Please join me in welcoming him to the Graduate Center. Professor Rodogno will deliver a brief presentation. This will be followed by commentary by each of our panelists, and then there will later be Q&A.
Right, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. Honored. I would like to thank the Primo Levi Center, Natalia, Alessandro. We've been collaborating for many, many years now, and I'm honored. I would like to thank the Ralph Bunche Institute, Meryl. Thank you very much, Daniel, and my fellow co-panelists. I'm delighted, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I will present you a little bit this book with this very strange title, and I will start exactly by doing that. But before I do that, I just wanted to explain what you're seeing on the screen there. This is the work of archaeologists in Greece in the island of Syros. they excavating what is left of a building which was used to host orphans in the 1920s, Armenian Orthodox Ottoman children, and I'm very, very pleased that allowed me to show some of this work, which is a work in progress. And then the title, Night on Earth. I have so many things to say, but I will start by saying probably the most important thing, which has to do with the fact that for this region of the world, the Near East, which meant different geographies for different people, but generally speaking encompassed the Caucasus, Greece, Lebanon, Cyprus, Anatolia, Asia Minor, Palestine, Egypt, where this area is experienced a night on earth, a very obscure, dark, grim, tragic moment for millions of people. Millions of people were forcibly displaced, killed in mass atrocities. There was a genocide, right? Misery, epidemics. So it is a night on earth for this reason. But it is a night on earth for another reason, and some of you might remember this movie by Jim Jarmusch in the early 1990s. For me, this is one of the best movies of that era, and is an iconic movie. And there are many reasons why it is related to my book. The first reason is the narrative framework of the movie itself. It's if any of you knows anything about Italian movie from the 60s and 70s, there are very often structures in episode with a thread, with a fil rouge. That's exactly what happens in this movie. And then there is another dimension which is immediately related to that. It's the metaphor. This is a movie about taxis, taxi drivers, and clients. And in my Night on Earth, the taxis are humanitarian institutions. The taxi drivers are the women and men that worked for these institutions. And the clients were the beneficiaries of this humanitarian aid. So before I go too far, I would like to show you 2 minutes, the official trailer of this movie. If technology and Danielle can assist us, that would be great. There is some strong language, and bear with it.
You go to Brooklyn?
Hello, how are you? Maksaville asiakkaalle keskellä yötä.
On vähän hiljaa ajaa.
Sä tässä on idiootti.
Lopettakaa nyt, saatana nuijat, vai haluatte sitten kävellä?
Io rimasi incantato.
E vai, e tata tu, quanto si dura ore. On va toujours une qui me fera pas chier.
Bien vu, connard, t'as failli m'écraser.
Dites, les aveugles, ils ne portent pas des lunettes noires d'habitude?
Ah ouais? Ah, je savais pas, j'ai jamais vu d'aveugle.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you something. I don't always want to be a cab driver. What do you really want to be? A mechanic.
Io sono pericoloso. Io c'ho i tassi, loro hanno le pistole, sono pericoloso io con i tassi. Che madosca.
It's not allowed. Not allowed.
Yes, allowed. This is New York. Pardon.
What the fuck is your fucking problem?
Hey, you're my problem.
Are you my fucking problem?
Hey, your hands are gonna be cursing me out.
Fuck you, and fuck you! Try driving school, you fucking Nimrod!
I'm sorry I sound calm. I assure you I'm hysterical.
Piazza Varma, Mrs. Hall. Helsinki.
Is somebody gonna tell me what the fuck is going on around here?
Oh, so let's go.
And the music is by Tom Waits. And, maybe the conference should be around Tom Waits, it would have been much better. Anyway, to go back to history, you can immediately imagine how this metaphor works. So, contrary to what happens when we get somewhere, the taxi driver is supposed to be a local person and the client is supposed to be the foreigner. As you've seen here in the case of New York, actually the taxi driver is not a local person. This happens systematically in the Near East during the interwar period. The taxi drivers, the humanitarians were foreigners, but also the clients were foreigners. So to go places was extremely difficult. So the metaphor works for me. And this is the reason why I refer to a tale of miscommunication here. And I think that this is very, very important. Right. So on the left-hand side, you can clearly see the structure of the book. There is a first chapter, which is a kind of dramatis persona. I present the main protagonist of my story, these Western institutions that operated in the Middle East from 1915 to 1928, no less. In the second chapter of the book, I really make a very strong argument, which can be summarized in 3 words. Contrary to what you might read in the archives, none of these institutions was calling the shots. Decisions were made on the military field by the military. They were made by politicians, policymakers in Paris, in Washington, in New York, in London, in Versailles, 1919, in Lausanne, in 1922, 1923. And the ears and the eyes of these humanitarians were really turned towards these places to try and understand what would happen to them afterwards. And in the archives, you read a fundamentally different story, which I had really to resist, where they are the main protagonists of these perfect plans. And I think this applies to humanitarians today in 2023. There is something else that I think is important. The rest of the book is just my night on earth. And I move from the Caucasus to Lebanon, from Syria to Palestine, and the rest with a few chapters on Greece. So the book is on humanitarians. The book is on humanitarianism. And ism, we should never forget, is an ideology like communism, liberalism, Nazism, fascism. Humanitarianism is an ism. We should never forget this. And if we add a little S and talk about humanitarianisms, we will be able to make space for autochthonous, indigenous forms of humanitarianism that are systematically forgotten in the books we read and write, because of course, local forms of aid are almost systematically ignored. The book is on humanitarian actions, is on relief and rehabilitation, and we are here in New York. We should never forget in New York, the first UN agency was called UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And this is because of the stories of the 1920s and 30s. And the legacy of these stories has been forgotten by many of us. I played with this. I had a dash between habilitation, rehabilitation, and reconstruction, because of course these people didn't care about rehabilitating. They wanted to habilitate. They assumed that they were working upon a tabula rasa because they were building civilization. So their posture is very colonial, and this should not, and racist, and this should not be forgotten. It was not about construction, reconstruction, it was about construction from scratch and development. And then we have to think about whose development. And I will show you a few things that will make you understand where I want to go with these particular points. The book has an awful lot to say about this discrepancy between these permanent ambitions to leave a trace of their work and the very ephemeral nature of the work of these humanitarians. The book is about nations, states, empires, mandates, and these non-state actors, including philanthropic foundations. And we talk, because we historians are obsessed with origins. We always want to find the origins of this and that. Well, for the Near East, if we forget to include the missionaries in the tale, in the story that we want to tell, we would make an enormous mistake. These missionaries embody modernity, they are part of it. So when we define modernity, we should make room for these people, whether that we like them or not. And last but not least, this is probably the most important thing since I've been studying and reading preliminary this reference to the saved and the drowned here is very important to me, very close to my heart. The book deals with very few saved, but we should never forget that millions of people were the drowned, to use the terms of I sommersi e salvati by Primo Levi. So this is equally important. And so the definition of what the book is about, as I told you, is taxis, taxi drivers, and clients, but this is a Promethean tale. And the best definition ever of what I mean by Promethean, you find it here. Prometheus, at best, was a tragic hero and the source of countless human tragedy, was guilty of hubris, of an arrogant overstepping of the bounds proper to humanity. And the result of this proffered godlikeness was a doubtful form of progress and advance, if indeed humans and their dreams were not turned back into dust. I think that this really summarizes pretty well what the book is about. This is the stereotypical image of humanitarian workers, kind of daily work. And these are the American Women's Hospital, provided food, I think, in Greece around 1923. And this is how these people define themselves. This is an official report to the American Congress of 1924, and this has to do with the work carried out by the Middle East Relief, which is one of the most important institutions I've been working on. And they define themselves as a humanitarian organization. This is them talking, it's not me. Middle East Relief has saved, and we trust will continue to save, many lives. We are not content, however, with the saving of lives, if by so doing we may prolong the physical existence of a certain number of human beings. We want not only to save life, but to make life, bigger life, better life, for a better day of peace and international goodwill that is to be. It is believed that most of our workers overseas are dominated by this ideal of unselfish service of their fellow men and the vision of a better world. This is their ideology. This is the heavy baggage they brought to the Near East when they moved in. And this is a very Rostowskian kind of, the 7 stages of man and the Middle East Relief. They go from rescue to healing, sustenance, repatriation, which, by the way, never happened, shelter, education, and self-support. And with every step, the goal is brought nearer. But this is a totally delusional thing, which never happened. Propaganda of these people was extremely sophisticated, and so these perfect narratives are really important, and they define what they were doing. And this is more of the same. On the left-hand side, you have this pamphlet by the American Women's Hospital. They quote Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was the founder of the American Relief Administration, a huge institution back then. And you can read our ideal is not only a child free from disease, it is also a child made free to develop to the utmost his capacity for physical, social, and mental health, which sounds, if you know anything about the WHO, a little bit like the charter of the WHO. So this is where we are in terms of discourse back in the 1920s. And on the right-hand side, I ask you to replace the center of the wheel, the word evangelization, with the word development, and you have, in essence, the vast majority of the UN program from the 50s to the 60s. It's pretty much the same thing. But of course, this is a missionary pamphlet of the early 1930s. And this is, we're back to Sirius, and this is the work of Drs. Zorzos and the team of archaeologists that are excavating the 2 children. These are the kind of artifacts that these children were doing, and this is what they dug out and found in Sirius last summer. And here you really have in italics the ideology of the Near East Relief. America found starving, diseased child refugees. She healed them, fed them, trained them. For what? We do not propose to leave them now to revert to backward mental, physical, and financial standards of their impoverished environment. Instead, we propose to use this young army of eager youth to set the peoples of the Near East on the pathway of progress. So this idea of the perfect path to progress is really what these people were doing. And this is more of the way, more of the same. What is very interesting in this propaganda is the place of women. We can go back and discuss this later on. And this is, to give you an idea, a very visual, once again, idea of what really happened. This is a map from 1923, so right after the Lausanne Conference and the Lausanne Treaty of 1923, and the three circles indicate where these institutions were operating. In and around Greece, in and around the Caucasus. Of course, the Soviets would expel them by 1928, 1929, and then they were thriving to some extent in Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. But the British and the French, once the mandate was set up, were not so happy to have all these people around. But there is a black hole in this map, Turkey, and this is the greatest defeat for the West. Nobody had imagined a Republic of Turkey. And the first thing that Ataturk did was to expel all these Western humanitarian institutions from the territory of the newly independent republic. So, and of course, this upset terribly the missionaries who had spent more than a century in Asia Minor, in Anatolia and this part of the world. I would like to conclude my short presentation telling you how limited I am, and I would like to underscore my imperfection. Had I been a good historian rather than Night on Earth, this would have been the narrative model of my book. My name is Red, because this would have given me the possibility of really make all the protagonists of my story, the saved and the drowned, talk, which is something that I could not do because it would have taken forever, and because I do not speak so many languages, and because what is left of these archives is very, very difficult. So I discarded this idea from the outset, but this would have been really my dream, and I want to share this with you because in any case, the book is published and it's too late. And I would like to conclude showing the woman on this cover, and this is really related to My Name is Red and Pamuk. We know very little about this woman. We know that she might have been Armenian or Greek Orthodox. She seems to smile if you look carefully. And this woman and what she represents, we know that she made it probably from the Black Sea region, from the Pontus region to the island of Macaronesia, which was a quarantine island not far from Athens. We know that she was alive. We do not know what happened to her. We do not know if she was forced to move to mainland Greece from Macaronesia to Salonika or Athens or elsewhere. We don't know if she died in Macaronesia, as many other people. In the archives, the stories of these people are objects, they are statues. We should never forget this. They have no agency. You don't see them moving. Very often they are shadows. We cannot touch them. They escape the work of the historian. But this particular woman is my ghost. She has been haunting me ever since I began this book. Many days and many nights. And this is why I wanted to conclude with this and more of the same. And with this quote by Murakami, which is also the epigraph of the book, which I let you read. And really, the work of these humanitarians, to me, it's just like clouds in the sky. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. We're going to ask for commentary from our discussants. Is there a preference to who goes first? Dr. Craze, would you like to go first? It's fantastic.
So I want to thank Davide for this wonderful book, but also in the nicest possible way, curse him, because I work in situations with a lot of humanitarians in Sudan and South Sudan at the moment, Egypt and Syria beforehand, and I meet this cast of characters, the adventurer, the missionary, the expert, that's me. And here they are, Davide reveals, back at the start of the 20th century. They're not merely horrendous apparitions of the 21st century, but they're here all through this wonderful book. And the line that struck me is from the epilogue, which is a quote that he begins with. And it says, "The paradox of care is that we tend merely to tolerate or leave alone those for whom we do not care or have compassion, even if what they are doing is harmful or goes against our values. However, when we see someone for whom we care or feel responsible doing something wrong or harmful or suffering in some way, we feel compelled to help. Even if what we do to help is not intentionally paternalistic or colonial in orientation, our interventions are more often than not an attempt to govern the lives of others. And I have to say, in the last decade that I've been working with humanitarians, my sense very much is that the entire endeavor is one fundamentally based on an asymmetry and on a form of domination. So because I was asked to be the nasty part of the commentators, I'm going to vas-y attack in the way that I've been asked to do, which is to say, I find the image of the taxi really interesting, right? And especially like the taxi in New York, where it's the foreigner driving, just like the humanitarians driving. But the question of the taxi for me also, and this is what I want to press you on, is this miscommunication that happens. Is this contingent? Can you imagine a good form of communication? Can the taxi work? Can it ever get to where you want to go to? Because I think Davide is a historian, and that means that he's incredibly nuanced and rich. And throughout the book, he reminds us that we should not be cynical, but be aware that humanitarians, for instance, do not often have bad intentions, but actually want to help the people. And I think you're right about that. And I think that maybe is the great tragedy, that they do want to help the people, but the system is structurally so bad that you never get to have a good communication in the taxi, that actually the words never meet. And that's why I wonder, one possible model of humanitarianism is the taxi, but the other is the prison, in which people are kept in situations of fundamental hierarchy, and they're not able to talk beyond those hierarchies. And the example I want to give, just because I was reading this book and I was like, how did this happen 100 years ago? These are my fieldwork notes from yesterday. There's a place called Yida, this is 10 years ago, and people from Sudan at the last civil war, not the current civil war, fled to Yida in South Sudan, and they built a beautiful vernacular city, twisting roads. People came from Congo to have photographic booths. People came from Rwanda to trade there. 70,000 people, the humanitarians turned up, and they thought, no way. We do not like this at all. It's too close to the border. There's too many soldiers and we can't control it. So slowly, over the course of a year, including with the use of cattle prods, they pushed people from this twisty Medina of a city into this sort of American suburban vision of what a refugee camp should be. So one refugee tent, another refugee tent, another refugee tent. And eventually, when everyone got there, the refugees started to riot. They started to riot because they're like, we're not allowed to work. We're not allowed to organize ourselves. We have no shops. And they said, but you're children. And it was so crucial to me throughout this book that one of the fundamental doubles, I think, is that the refugee, the recipient of aid is turned into a child. And it's not that they are children, but they're made children via the very function of the intervention. You're made a child because you're not allowed to work for yourself, because you don't get to decide on your own aid. And the other figure that I thought you beautifully explored was the Prometheus. That's the figure we think of when Oxfam stops us on the street and says, please give money to the humanitarians. And they're beautiful and they save lives. But as you also say, really importantly, they're weak Prometheuses. Actually, they don't get, and I think this is as true now as it was at the turn of the 20th century, to decide on much. They're subsidiary to political actors. They're subsidiary to military actors. So they become a perverse figure who actually only get to exert control, really, over the recipient populations and not form themselves into the great places, the great sort of vision of themselves as all-powerful Prometheuses that they hope to be. So the real question to you is, can you have a good conversation in the car, or is this entire enterprise needs to go straight to the garage? Is it savable? And like the three brief points of critique I want to say is, look, it's not savable. One, why? For all the talk in NGOs and humanitarian circles you have in this book, just as in the present, is about listening to communities, being there for communities. But fundamentally, the money for humanitarian work comes from overseas. And when that money stops, the humanitarians leave. And it's that money that shapes the extent of humanitarian interventions. The second problem is simply temporality, that we've now had 100 years of emergency aid. Where I work in South Sudan, the oldest institution is Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And every year a new chief of medicine, and I like Doctors Without Borders and I work for them sometimes, a new chief comes in and goes, okay, we're going to save the country, here's how it goes. And then the next year there's a new chief, I'm like, hi, new chief, what are you going to do? I'm going to save the country, wait for it, you haven't heard this before. And every year, because it's structured as a series of emergency interventions, it's not structured in terms of developmental aid. It's not structured as an imaginary of the future. And I thought one of the other interesting things in this book is the excavation of these histories where proto-development and humanitarianism come into conversation. But today, when you go to Syria, when you go to South Sudan, when you go to Sudan today, everyone is consistently creating a system of humanitarian emergency intervention that ends up actually just feeding the government and ends up feeding the people creating the humanitarian disaster that the aid is designed to ameliorate. So my question, wearing my nasty hat, which I'm now going to take off, is simply, should we put this taxi in the garage?
A lot to contend with. Do you want to answer
No,
this? You, okay. All right. No, I'm not going to mention Ukraine. I live and breathe Ukraine, so I'm not going to talk about Ukraine. Meryl and Daniel, thank you for inviting me. It's very nice to be here with Joshua and Davide, who I feel like I know because this is now the second book of his that's on my bookshelf. The other one is called Against Massacre, and it's a history of humanitarian intervention in the 19th century. Just a word on how I came to know of Davide, and this was prearranged. This what I'm about to tell you. We have in common a friend. We had, I should say, it's hard for us to think of him in the past tense. Eric Weitz, distinguished professor of history at the City College of New York and at the Graduate Center. And I was writing a book on humanitarian intervention some years ago. It's actually, that book came after the Ukraine book. And I was reading a book which traced the idea of humanitarian intervention back to the 19th century. And the argument went roughly as follows, that there was this commitment to the sanctity of human life and a transcendent norm which asserted that killing innocent people was unacceptable, and the European powers intervened in what was then the Ottoman Empire to stop the killing of Christians, but it didn't matter that they were Christians. Fundamentally, they were human beings. This just didn't ring true to me. It seemed too potted a history, too sanctimonious a history. And I said to Eric, can you point me in the direction of someone who's worked on humanitarian intervention in the 19th century, who happens to actually be a historian, reads local languages and knows about these? So you have to read Davide Rodogno's book, Against Massacre. So that's how I came to know him. So now to this book, and I'm going to do something different. I don't have a nasty hat or a nasty cape or anything to take off. I'm going to ask you some questions and ask you to respond to them. One of the themes that suffuses this book, and by the way, I would urge you to read it because it's beautifully written, is very detailed, but you don't get swallowed up by the details because the details elaborate themes that will stay with you, which is one of the reasons why it's easy to talk about this book. One of the themes in the book, by the way, excuse me if I cough and sneeze, it's allergy season, and I'm allergic to everything anywhere, maybe even including humans, possibly. Some humans anyway, I won't name them. One of the themes, Davide, in the book is that you have on the one hand these humanitarians who put on their cape of salvation and redemption and go into these areas they see as backward. And they have a mission not just to deliver things or build schools or to educate, but to transform and uplift and drag into the 20th century people who really don't think can quite make it, but they're going to try their best. So there's a great deal of compassion for the downtrodden. On the other hand, their view of the people they're going to save is, as Davide points out with very choice quotations, thoroughly racist. There's social Darwinism, there's scientific racism. I don't know if there's phrenology, but there's something close to that. And there is this belief that these, and this echoes something that Joshua said, these are children. They have no agency, they have no capacity to think, and they therefore can never be independent, which is exactly, by the way, as Davide pointed out, what the League of Nations and the mandate that it gave to the imperial powers, it was premised on this notion. These people can't stand, let alone walk, and so we have to take care of them. What I want to ask you is this. So these humanitarians are male and female, young and old. Some of them are medical people, doctors or nurses. Others are teachers. They come from different parts of the world. But you point out in the book, or as I read it anyway, that these ideas that I just mentioned, the not so nice ideas, are prevalent throughout. So one question I have is, how do we explain the fact that these people came from different walks of life and are individuals, some of them missionaries, by the way, right, connected to God, and had these horrific ideas, but they all seem to hold them. So that's one thing that puzzles me. The second has to do with your taxi metaphor. And if I read you correctly, you adapt the metaphor somewhat. So there is the taxi, which is the space in which the saving and the saved are operating. And then you have the taxi driver. He or she holds the wheel, and the ultimate decision of where you are going to go from point A to point B and how you're going to go there is in that person's hands. Never mind that there's chattering in the back about, well, I know the better way and so on. The people chattering in the back and with ideas and so on are stand-in for the people who are being saved. So here's the question. In the metaphor that you evoke, there are people in the back seat and they're backseat drivers. Well, I know this happens in New York all the time. Take 126th Street, it's one way, whatever, right? And taxi drivers often get really, well, what's the technical term? Pissed off because they've been doing this a long time and you haven't. The difficulty I have, the question I have is that when the taxi metaphor is used, you have people with agency, right? They have ideas on where to go and how to do things, and they're very opinionated. But as you pointed out, in the accounts of the humanitarians, the people they're saving are utterly without agency. We have no idea what they are thinking. Are they grateful for the assistance they're receiving? Would they like to be helped in some kind of different way? What are their aspirations? What are their dreams? So does the taxi metaphor work in this sense? Because we don't know what the people in the back seat are doing, because they're not the people, the New Yorker who's impatient saying, take me this way, not that way. They're voiceless and they're not represented in any way. Have you been able to get some sense of what it is that they thought when all of this beneficence was being bestowed upon them? That's one question. The final question is this, and I'm sure you've been asked this 1,000 times. I'm going to put on not my nasty hat, but my conservative hat. So a conservative would ask you some question like this. Well, Professor Rodogno, isn't it wrong to judge the humanitarians by today's standards? Yes, they were thoroughly racist and orientalists. Yes, the late Edward Said was correct. We can't have this kind of thing anymore. But in those days, that was the lingua franca. That's what people talked about. And would you go so far as to say, because you have a lot of critical things to say about them, this is me channeling the conservative, not me talking. Would they have been the people who were being served, given that war, ethnic cleansing, all manner of hideous things were happening? Would they have been better served had the do-gooders not been on the scene at all? The final question is this. You must have started out with some working notion of what the book was going to be about and what you expected to find. If you had to name a couple of things that really surprised you, what would they be? Okay. Yeah, I noticed you didn't take any notes when either Joshua or I spoke, so you must have a photographic memory.
I don't know. You will see immediately. So can I reply in reverse order? Yes. So to complicate and to keep you awake. So the first question, the last question that you ask really has to do with, and I do get this an awful lot. I'm persuaded that these people would have been much better off if Western humanitarian institution had trusted local associations and groups of refugees themselves that, contrary to what they thought, had very clear ideas about what they wanted to get. And the example of the refugee camp that you gave is the perfect example of a self-organization of these groups. So this is a way for me to combine a few of the elements that both of you pointed out. But this is an impossibility. And this is, for me, also a way of engaging with a number of points that you made. This is an impossibility because the assumption is just like Wittgenstein uncertainty, which I quote in the book several times. Unfortunately, my brother is a philosopher, so I was exposed to this thing. And Wittgenstein is absolutely right. There is no space for any kind of doubt in the brains of these people that are going to save other people. So we will never know if this alternative could have worked better or worse. I have no answer to that. And this would be counterfactual history, but it's an impossibility. It's an impossibility, and this explains why things went the way they went.
So just so I'm clear, it didn't even occur to them to seek any advice from the locals because they didn't know anything worth knowing.
No, and they were doing exactly what these guys from Médecins Sans Frontières are doing now. They were reinventing the wheel every time. And on so many occasions, they were just repeating in a less efficient way what the Ottomans were doing. That's and the hated Ottomans, which encompassed everything that had to do with these barbaric, half-civilized kind of world. So this is the paradox. And this is where, you know, turning a deaf ear or a blind eye to what was happening on the ground turned things into very bizarre projects. They became the slaves of technology because they brought in all these equipments from the West. They shipped in New York very often. All the travel of the American Red Cross group of people, 70 people from New York City to Yafo, is an amazing story. Once they get to Palestine, they realize that, there are no roads. What are we going to do? What is going to happen? All this medical equipment is not going to be, it cannot be used because we have all male doctors. Women, local women will never come to us to get vaccinated. So there are all these things that happen. So the only thing that they can do is just to clean a few hospitals, which is exactly what the Ottomans were already doing. So
you point out, by the way, that they had no idea that Muslim organizations and the Ottoman Empire itself had a tradition of refugee relief.
Absolutely. They had no clue. Or the fact that the Armenians, just like the Afghani people today, I mean, there is always a spearhead that leave the village and then the others will follow. Many Armenians did the same. So when they got somewhere, whether this is Cilicia or Lebanon or Syria, etc., the others followed and they organized themselves in ways which were far from being perfect. But this was something that shows all of us their agency. When the humanitarian came, they destroyed everything. And also they wanted these people to move elsewhere because they relied on railways. So even the concept of mobility, it's something that they brought from the West, which was completely not working given the context over there. And if I go back to the other questions that you asked me, one is also very philosophical and has to do with temporality. In the brains of these people, there is just a possible time. The very fact that people might appreciate time differently, it's not considered, it's not possible. And the clients have to adapt to the time of the taxi driver. And there is no other way. and the tale is a tale of progress. There is no way, it's impossible to regress. So the idea of a circularity of time is not contemplated by any of these actors, which is very problematic if you think about it. It was very problematic at the very beginning of the 20th century for religious reasons. It's very problematic today. This is a point that I really want to make. And the other 2 points that I wanted to make very shortly relate to human condition. This is the reason why the taxi will never go to the garage. And this is why human, in all our fantastic stupidity, are going to repeat the same stupid story ever again. And I think that this taxi will go around and round and round from one place to another, repeating exactly the same mistakes. I will conclude with you could have killed me with the metaphor of the taxi. You were very elegant and you didn't do it. There is a fundamental mistake in my metaphor, which in any case has many limits. My mistake is the following. In my case, clients have no money and taxi drivers are supposed to ride them for free. Humanitarian actions are supposed to be gifts. They are never a gift. There's not, we say this in America, there's no such a thing like a free lunch. This is the sentence that we say, right? Okay. So these people had to pay in a way or in another. So their liberation and their civilization came with a price. So the metaphor of the taxis is flawed because the money issue and the gift dimension is something that I didn't work on, and I didn't want to engage with that. But I hear you, and you are absolutely right. The metaphors serve my purposes, but has clear limitations. I think I addressed a few things, right, in this order.
It's just striking that, you know, you show a group of people who are brimming with self-confidence and certitude. They represent the scientific method, they represent the future, but they're shockingly ignorant about the place where they've come to live and work. The roads, for example.
Yes.
Or who locally.
Yes.
They know nothing. So they turned up, and so they're surprised constantly and feeling. Yeah. By the way, much of the book, I think, retraces the debates that have been going on now about nation building or humanitarian intervention or foreign aid and relief. It's very contemporaneous, this book. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
So the mind is a little bit.
Ah, sorry about that.
I mean, isn't that part of the sadness, is that they don't need to know anything because of their method? Because if you come with this plan for what the human is, and these are children and they are in some sense ahistorical, they don't have anything other than physical needs, and you've reduced them to those needs, you can have the same plan. So in South Sudan, when the first humanitarians came in after the country became independent, they were Serbians, and their plan was from Congo. And they were like, this worked in Congo, so it's going to work here. Actually, it didn't work in Congo and it didn't work there, but there's that same repetition of plans across the world, which is enabled by this fundamental asymmetry.
There are two things that I wanted to say, and the first really connects with what you just said. Many of these humanitarians had their own experiences, and that here I'm talking about the Americans in particular, in two different contexts. With immigrants in this country, the Italians, the Irish, etc. Betterment projects, urban projects, etc. And there is another strand, which I think is the most striking and the most interesting one, is the connection between the work that is undertaken by American philanthropic foundations in the American South, work for autochthonous populations in the American South, and of course for African Americans. If you think about the curricula that are set up for schools for children in the American South, for African American children, this is exactly what they wanted to set up in Greece, in Lebanon, in Syria. It's always the same kind of curriculum there, because these people are all the same to them. And this is incredibly, gross and racist in so many ways. But this is the way it is. The second point, which I think is also very philosophical, but very true. humanitarians, and it's not just them. It's the same for lawyers, judges in different contexts, and you will see where I want to get with this. Humanitarians desperately need chaos to exist. They need war to exist. If we were living in a Kantian world, in a perpetual peace kind of system, they would be useless, right? So they need chaos to thrive. Once they get into this chaos, they need to set up order, their kind of order. This is exactly the example that you gave. Hence, a refugee camp has to look like what their brain has produced. And there is no space whatsoever for any other shape of order, any other idea of order. And there is not a conversation. Because if you start opening up, if you open up a conversation, why are you there, you humanitarian? In the early 20th century, these thoughts, which I think are very present today, because many humanitarians today are able to make very interesting self-critiques. I've not seen many of my people in the early 20th century, doubting about the purpose of their mission, so to say. This is a fundamental difference, perhaps, between the 1920s and the 2020s. Is it any better? I let you discuss. 2023 is beyond me.
What you have to do is take Davide back to meet your guy in the Message Sans Frontières.
Yes, I mean, would be come south, not that.
They will not like me very much.
I mean, I think the interesting thing about that second example, right, is that the temporality is one that says we are only here for an emergency. We need that chaos, but the point of our work is that we go away, right? The point is not to build something. The point is not really to be there. And so that's also why you have tents rather than setting up cities. Because if you're setting up cities, then somehow you're a collective subject together, you're working together rather than you intervening over there. But then the problem is, of course, in a situation in which there is chaos, and you also exist from that chaos, that you get the sense of a place like Dadaab, which is the major Somali camp in Kenya, where people have been born there, and now they're dying there. And you have a generation of people who are 70, and they've only known that camp. And so you have that permanent exception, in which still in camps today, humanitarians will go, no, we don't want to have work projects, or in one of the camps in South Sudan, they put up this great solar paneled streetlights. And then the camp coordinator found out that the young people were using the solar batteries to have discos. And she was horrified because that meant that they were having fun, which means they might stay in the camp. So they banned all the solar panels. They just took away all the street lighting to ensure that they were surviving, but not having too much fun. Right, so so it's coming back to that question of temporality here. You have this weird logic. Yes, it's about progress and bringing people to liberal democracy wherever we're going. But actually what it involves is keeping people where they are, because you're not allowed to acknowledge that this war is the new state, right? Like the war is always the exception. Humanitarianism is the exception. It's just now lasted 100 years.
Should we throw it open to the audience, perhaps?
Yeah, we're gonna open it up to Q&A, and I think instead of passing the mic back and forth, we can ask the panelists to maybe reiterate the question and then respond.
Or ask people to come out to the podium. Okay, that's.
Can we do it in iambic pentameter each question?
Yeah.
There is, yeah.
Suggested abuse that children endure in these contained situations. And I wonder if there's something that of knows that is comparable to what happened to Native American children who were
Could you all hear this?
Shall I repeat it? So the question is about the abuses of children in the context of the Near East and the comparison with similar abuses committed against Native American children before or during this time? It's a fantastic question, I think. First of all, because these are strands of literature that don't talk to each other. So my colleagues who are specialists of these kind of issues work very little on what I do and vice versa. And I think it's very wrong because we would find out very striking similarities. I can give you one example. The vast majority of children, Armenian children in Greece, so survivors of the genocide, who are displaced for all sorts of reasons, from Anatolia, Asia Minor, for wherever they were living, to Greece. They end up in Greece. In every program that the Near East Relief set up, there is a dimension which is precisely about erasing the Armenian identity of these children, changing their names, changing also their religion from Armenian, Gregorian, moving to Orthodox, and becoming Hellenized, becoming Greek. The last, and this I found documents in which they say, you don't want to remain Armenians, you want to be assimilated to become real Greeks if you want to survive in this country. So this is one example that I have. And of course, this always concerns orphans. The problem the Near East Relief has is that, contrary to the case of autochthonous population of the American continent, whether in Canada or in the USA, many parents survived. And these parents were known because of bureaucracy and because of modernity. And so some of these children could not be Hellenized, and they had to be outplaced or given back to their families. And this, in a way, I think makes also a difference with so many children in the case of the USA and Canada and the autochthonous population of this continent. So there are similarities because these people are the same people that operated on this continent with the same roots, with the same modi operandi. And I think that there is a need to research so much more about how these questions connect. That's why I think it's an excellent question.
I think you were next, then Michal. Why don't you go? I appointed myself traffic cops.
Thank you.
Yes, much for the conversation. So I wanted that maybe that video you like to cast some light on the role of realistic actors. So I was thinking what the outcomes and what the accomplishment they developed those days compared to maybe what happened to the non-realistic actors today. Some of them, if they have survived, we're talking about the Red Cross, also like Doctors Without Borders, but there's some other.
Save the Children is very old. Yeah.
It's part of the conversation. The challenges of non-realistic actors. He was mentioning like this. The structure today, like and this separation comment, I totally agree about this humanitarian intervention need to be an exception. I mean that should be like a persistent and then next is comparison for development so that these areas can be dependent and autonomous in wealth and progress. That should be like this persistent. And then next we need some other kind of tools.
Okay, I summarize first. So it's no, but it's really on the accomplishments and the when does humanitarian aid stops and something else begins, whether we call it development or something else. Is that?
Yeah, well, it was. I think on how we
and then the
those things and today, and also like
when it comes to these institutions like the ICRCs and the International Committee of the Red Cross, etc., they were already very big. But we should not forget that with the end of the First World War, all these institutions, including Save the Children, are really dwarfed by the arrival of the Americans. And the American Relief Administration is a huge machine which is supported by the government and uses the money of the US government, which is not exactly how these other institutions fundraised, right? Save the Children use fundraising techniques, which are still in place today, a little bit more sophisticated, but at the time, not only they are not supported by the UK government, they are not very much liked within the perimeter of the British government. So there is this huge difference. The ICRC, which is the oldest of them all, they are not an NGO. Never say to an ICRC person that they work for an NGO, they are something different. And there are Swiss colleagues here and they will, correct me if I say so. The ICRC is, and there again, I mean, if we do not reflect historically, we will make all sorts of anachronism. The ICRC back then has no problem whatsoever in starting reconstruction projects, state building, nation building project. They set up barracks and entire neighborhoods in Athens. They don't exist anymore because they were wooden barracks, so they are not here anymore. But the very idea of things that today, in today's terminology, we would refer to as the triple nexus or anything like that, were already done by these humanitarians back then. All these fancy names that we use today were absent because, of course, they didn't need them. Because, of course, they wanted to stay and leave a trace of this permanent change that they had brought in these areas. That's a fundamental difference. This is a proclaimed imperial kind of persuasion that they have. This is 1920. Thank you.
Sorry to point at you, but.
So I'm looking here for you people. I would like to know whether within these organizations operating in these territories, whether it was a clash between the legal project and the different organizations, and whether, if you refer to the example that you made in the first question, you were talking about, for example, project of indemnizations of the children from Armenia. Whether, and I'm going back to sort of like the first questions, whether within that kind of imposition from above of those political projects, you were able to find in your sources pushbacks and sort of like moments in which the narrative of social work interviewing or like imposing or attempting to sort of like change and sort of children as tabula rasa and the refugees as valuables. But within that, you were able to find like moments of resistance, and therefore sort of going back to the question of the agency of people who receive the help like that, and whether that sort of like gave you openings to the life to receive assistance.
First of all, it's an excellent question, and truly, yes, the question is on these political clashes and the role and the compromises or not that these institutions made with governments, right? Okay. The summarizing part is probably the most difficult thing that I have to do tonight, because I don't want to disrespect, your thoughts. So, but anyway, if I got you correctly, so yes, there are so many examples of this story. The tensions between these institutions, humanitarian organizations on the ground, and governments, or local authorities, generally speaking, are multiple. They happen on a daily basis. So, for instance, the tensions between the embassies, the consulates, and these institutions are all over the place. Just to give you an example, the British were supposed to collaborate, the British consul was supposed to collaborate with Nansen, who represents the League of Nations, hates Nansen. And he really writes, the last thing we want is to collaborate with the League of Nations. So there is something typical for us today in 2020, if you think about the UN, etc. But this is how things happened. And if you think about the Refugee Settlement Commission in Greece, is the most clear example of this tension, because when the Refugee Settlement Commission, which is, by the way, the institution that is supposed to replace 1 million refugees somewhere in mainland Greece and in a few islands, when these institutions is set up, one of the conditions is precisely we stop relief operations, and we will give seeds and agricultural tools and maybe a mule to these people so that they can start working. Local NGOs like Save the Children say, hey guys, if we don't feed them, you can give every tool you want, but these people will die. By the end of the winter, they will not be there. So what are we doing here? This is, and who's the best partner of this institution? The Greek government, because they see what is happening very, very clearly. So these tensions happen on a daily basis. Another very, very clear example is what happened to all Protestant institutions in Lebanon when the French move in and this becomes a colony. There is no space for the Protestants anymore. So they will favor either Catholic institutions or French-based institutions, or proxies, the Lebanese, that are going to, or the Armenians, who are going to be friends with the French government and will follow the political agenda, which has nothing to do with their needs. So all these stories that we are so familiarized with in 2023 were already happening back in 1920. So this is why I think the question is, and this separation of the political from the humanitarian, which is what we discuss on a daily basis, whether we talk about Sudan or any other place, the Rohingya or any other crisis that happens or keep going on, was already there. So yeah, thank you.
Michal, but before you ask the question, I'm going to leave it to you to watch the clock. So, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Michal.
Thank you. So kind of a general question about maybe, but I worked on congenitally on humanitarian in Central Asia, and I'm wondering how when we go for kind of theories of humanitarianism, we talk about the humanitarian and the recipient, but we also have a big player in the black market.
Yes.
Black market is a big player in any humanitarian situation, and I feel like there's always this kind of discomfort about whether this is something that should be socially united explicitly or ignored, or what do you do that?
Yeah. So I try to summarize the question is really on the political economy and black markets of humanitarianism. The black market is all over the place in the sources that I read. And I don't think, and the amount of disruption that humanitarians brought wherever they went is just phenomenal. It's more than that. One anecdote has to do with onions, olive oil, and butter. So for the Swiss, it was impossible to imagine a diet based on onions and olive oil, and they were desperate to find butter in Greece, which existed, of course, but not in the kind of quantities that they expect to collect, buy at a price which was really off anything that could be considered a regular market. So it was a black market and the black economy. And there were an awful lot of pushbacks. And of course, they could have done differently had they considered that the diet of these people was not really the typical Swiss diet, right? The same goes with powder milk. And of course, and I talked to the Swiss colleagues in the room, who's the greatest provider of powder milk? But Nestlé, of course. Who else? So this is equally problematic, and it's also a fantastic innovation, right? Which disrupts the markets, because the fact the milk could be transported and could be used in cans and powder is, of course, makes a huge difference. And the invention of the calorie, which goes with that. So these are all things that produce or distort the markets. The last example that I have precisely concern the Caucasus. And with the Caucasus, we enter and we go back to your question on the politics, the Sovietization of these areas. What happens when the Soviets come in and how they're going to cope with the presence of these Near East relief people. The vast majority of them were either missionaries or ex-US soldiers. So there is a big problem there. But there is also a big problem because they can buy stuff from other areas and transport them with the trains into the Soviet area. So in terms of a market that now works in a Bolshevik context, you can only imagine the resistance that came from Bolshevik authorities. This was the beginning of the end of the American adventure in the Caucasus. Thank you. Yeah.
We have a question. The picture you painted is really hopeless.
No.
No, there's some hopes on something that is so fundamental about society, which is we want to go out and something good. Now, in the course of the century that that goes around this story today, the world is suffering enormously more. I mean, the Near East is in a condition that is hundreds of times more devastated than it was already, at the end of the First World War. So clearly something went wrong. And I wonder if, all these nice thoughts, this is really important research. It would be great that our politicians and our scholars and students, the people took this at heart and changed something in our society. Otherwise, we're sitting here and everything is collapsing. And then what we do, is there an end to this work? So I wonder if perhaps there is something that is more related to us, to the people who are actually seeing these things. So if we see the problem, maybe we're wrong about something, but maybe the reason why things don't work are different. We're so small compared to this enormous political, technological, international machine. And there's something that with the center we've been looking at, which is, I'm sorry if I go long, but the notion of righteousness. Something that allowed the fascist regime to function so well was that allowed a lot of functionaries to feel righteous about themselves, to feel that they had a righteous goal, even if 3 steps removed where it was killing people, but their little part was, had to do with saving the country, saving the families, saving the value, and sometimes saving people. I think that there were spaces to save people that they were designed by the totalitarian regime exactly to allow so many functionaries of the state to proceed in their work, because nobody wants to think of themselves as criminals. So we're also righteous because we see the problem. Is there something that can be done among scholars, politicians, people who, write, and where is there a place where we can actually act and exit this pervasive, basically, yes, we can point the finger, but we can't solve the problem.
Yeah. I think if you look at what's happening in Sudan right now, WFP, MSF, all those offices have been looted by Hemeti, by one of the fighting parties. And in Khartoum, there are networks of mutual aid being set up by the resistance committees. And they work much better than that WFP food aid. Why do they work much better? Because people are making decisions in some Rousseauian sense about themselves. And I think the history of humanitarianism that we've seen tonight is the history of claiming that you can make a decision about someone else. And I think the history of what's wrong with that, right, is that precisely you arrogate to yourself this righteousness to determine something. And what's interesting about even forms of aid that still continue in the world today, in South Sudan, in Syria, is when they're collective. So when you're not saying, I am here and I will tell you what to do, but saying, we're going to think something together. Because those mutual aid networks right now that exist, not to channel Kropotkin too much in Khartoum, are not just of Sudanese people. They're of non-Sudanese, they're of expatriates, they're people like me. There's all sorts of people working together, but without the assumption of righteousness, without the assumption of distance. And I think that's what fundamentally hampers, as a project, humanitarianism as something that tries to improve our world.
You gave a perfect answer to your question or comment. It is a very difficult one because I would like to forget about the book for a second and give the answer that I give every year to my students who ask exactly the question that you're asking. And this is where, as you said at the very beginning, throughout the book, I also try and stay away as much as I can from any kind of cynicism. And I persuaded that a line exists between being cynical and being critical. And it's very stupid to say that all the lines are blurred. They are not. You can be cynical and you can be very critical, as I am, staying away from cynicism, which I think don't bring you anywhere. So it doesn't do any kind of good. Having said that, when it comes to, I'm not, and this is why the taxis cannot go to the garage, not only because this is the human condition that I was referring to, but because there is also something else. I'm not entirely persuaded that our world would be a better place if humanitarians were not around. I have no evidence of that, but I just a very modest guess that it wouldn't be necessarily a better place, a better world. And I also think that there are two words that you said, small and modest, which are extremely important and key to understand how things could be done. If we think of humanitarian endeavors are being grand and huge projects, I do see an awful lot of problems related to arrogance and this manipulation of righteousness that you referred to. Whereas small, contained, modest projects might have or hide, conceal several virtues, which are made of, knowing the people, doing things with a very specific aim, and stopping there, rather than repeating or reinventing the wheel, because your project, the very way you set up your institutions is a never-ending one. Your institution will never die. No, these institutions have to be ephemeral, because what moves you probably has to do with a very specific reason or a crisis or whatever it is that you are moved by. And the very big, broader picture of saving the humanity is what scares me an awful lot. So I am not hopeless at all. I'm very hopeful, and I have to be hopeful as a teacher. If I stop believing that we can do a little bit better, I better find a different kind of business. Thank you.
Well, I would ask everybody to join me in giving a huge round of applause to our fantastic panel. Thank you so much, Dr. Rodogno, Dr. Craze, and Dr. Menon for your rich commentary. Before we close, I also would like to say a few thanks to the folks who really made this event happen. One of them, of course, is the Ralph Bunche Institute, Assistant Director of European Union Studies at the Ralph Bunche Institute, and that is Meryl Savner, who worked tirelessly to put this together, as well as the efforts of the Central Levy Center, and that is by Natalia and Indrumi. Thank you so much also for your contributions to tonight. Yes, and of course, I also want to thank the Geneva Graduate Center Institute's Alumni Association, and of course, the Swiss Mission to the UN, who also contributed. So thank you to the audience for your wonderful questions. And we have some refreshments in the back, and we'd like to ask you to join us in perhaps continuing this conversation on an individual basis. Thank you.
My apologies.
I will.
I will. Let's stay in touch.
Absolutely.